The Helldivers 2 falloff needs to be studied. Helldivers 2 is a case study on how to completely kill off any positive sentiment and goodwill from your community. How you can turn a once staunch and devout loyal fanbase into an angry mob of gamers within the span of a few months has to be an achievement. It's gotten so bad that players have collectively decided to just let the enemies invade Super Earth and protest. Even their own subreddit has started to revolt against the game because they're just at a point where they're fed up with Arrowhead's antics. Helldivers 2 is now seeing the lowest player drop that it's ever seen before, at an astounding 95% decline from its peak of 450,000 players to barely just around 13,000, sometimes even dropping below 10k. This is so wild to me because the devs had such a good product in their hands with so much potential to become one of the best live service games ever made if they had just listened to their community. But alas, this was not the case because the developers chose to stick with their own flawed game design philosophy of removing fun gameplay elements for the sake of balance in a fully PvE co-op title. And the players have been expressing their opinion about this since day one, but for some reason though, the devs refuse to listen to any of the feedback given to them through their many feedback channels, like the subreddit or the Discord. Now it's gotten so bad that the recent Steam reviews are at a dismal 46%, with many more players expressing the same sentiment on other platforms. So that raises the question, how did they mess up so badly, and how did it even get to this point in the first place? Well, this all really began when the first balance patch for Helldivers came out, where they nerfed the best equipment at the time, the railgun, the shield generator, and the breaker shotgun. And to be fair, they did buff some other weapons as compensation, but they were still nowhere near the level of usefulness as the nerfed equipment. This update was the first time that players started to voice their concerns about how the dev team is approaching balancing because they felt like there was no real reason in reducing player power for the sake of fairness. This patch caused a bit of controversy, and a small vocal minority of players made a bit of a stink on the internet, which was a bit of drama at the time, but with the internet being the internet, it was soon forgotten after about a week. And even though those disgruntled players eventually moved on from this whole debacle, they sure as hell didn't forget about it. Although this patch didn't really do any tangible damage to the game in the short term, it did sow some seeds of doubt within the player base about whether or not Arrowhead would be able to properly develop this game in the right direction. So eventually everyone moved on and quietly hoped that this was just a one-off occurrence because the devs were relatively new to handling live services of this size. People essentially just gave Arrowhead a bit of leeway because they're kind of a small studio and this was really their first quote-unquote big project. They also never really had any history of ruining their past games as well, so maybe this was a learning experience for the studio. Well, not exactly, because you see, the very same thing would happen again in the next patch update to the game, where Arrowhead would once again nerf the fun weapons because too many people were using them, and they wanted to keep them in line with the other unfun weapons. This is where they all but confirmed the design philosophy of taking player power away in order to force them to use other weapons instead of bringing the weak weapons up to the level of the strong ones. Which, for a co-op PvE only game, this is an extremely backwards thought process. The thing is that balancing first originated from PvP games because devs had to account for the player enjoyment on all sides. They had to make sure everyone was having fun in their game or else they would just start leaving. For example, you can have a really cool weapon or character that's really powerful and satisfying for the user, which is all well and good. But however, if it's unenjoyable to be on the receiving end of that really powerful weapon or character, then that person is more likely to quit. Which obviously the developers don't want that to happen. Ideally, in a perfect world, you would want everything in the game to feel fun while also being fair for everyone at the same time. That's the difficulty of balancing a competitive game where your opponents are other human beings. So logically, if your opponents are AI, then that means no one's gonna get upset when things are unbalanced, right? No one's gonna go on to make a Reddit post about being beat by the most overpowered stuff in the meta. You get all the fun part of being able to use the strong weapon or characters without the unfun parts of having it used against you. It's a win-win for everyone involved. The only issue you might run into is low gameplay variety, because of course everyone wants to play the strongest and most enjoyable thing in the meta. That's why instead of searching for what people found fun in the meta and nerfing that to the ground like a game of whack-a-mole, they should instead buff everything else to the same level as the top tiers. This way it adds more variety into the meta while keeping players satisfied with it. That is how you create a long-lasting and loyal community for your PvE co-op title, by catering to the players and listening to the people that support you. But the fact that Arrowhead is balancing the game like it's a PvP title is very concerning, because the community has been essentially begging the devs for months to stop trying to nerf the good weapons and focus on buffing the weak ones. The developers have apparently acknowledged that they'll work towards that sentiment, but their actions tell a different story, as they would continue to nerf fan favorite weapons and make questionable changes that no one asked for, which would put into question their competence as a development team and would pretty much kill any confidence players had with them. Although Helldivers 2 is far from being a dead game, many players have already quit the game long ago due to the many growing frustrations they had with the direction it was going. But the players put up with it for months and months until the release of Escalation of Freedom, where it would finally reach its breaking point. While the update did add a bunch of brand new content like new enemies and maps and whatnot, which itself would have made for a pretty good update, but alas, all of it was undermined by the nerfs that came with it, which the community did not receive very lightly, to say the least. This update was sort of the breaking point for the community, the last straw. And this was it for probably a couple of reasons, but the biggest one was because it nerfed a bunch of fire-based weapons while releasing an entire battle pass based around fire weapons. Whose idea was that? Because the once loyal player base have now revolted against Arrowhead in protest of these balancing decisions. The people have been outspoken about this since the game's release, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Enough is enough. The frustrations would be even further exemplified in their uneven attempt at creating realism in Helldivers. You know, the game where you kill aliens and sentient AI with lasers and galactic orbital cannons. Yeah, well, it seems that as a player you're forced to adhere to realism, like having limited ammo or being ragdolled when you get hit by an explosion. And now apparently after the recent changes, your flamethrower can't even go through enemies anymore, and they just deal pitiful damage to anything bigger than a dog. So that fantasy of burning through a horde of bugs is completely dead now, all for the sake of being realistic. But for some reason the enemies don't have to follow these rules, because why not? They have infinite ammo, immunity to ragdolling, and no collision with corpses. The developers seem to be hellbent on adding so many military simulation elements to this game with the intention of inconveniencing the player instead of enhancing their experience. Players will only look past these frustrations if they're satisfied with the rest of the game, but they're not, so it becomes pretty irritating and just adds on to the laundry list of things that push people to quit. It also didn't help that there was this whole Sony debacle where the publisher Sony forced every player to create a PlayStation account in order to continue playing Helldivers, which didn't go over so well with the Helldivers community, to say the least, because this proposal would receive universal backlash from everybody. Fortunately though, Sony would reverse their decision to go through with this. Unfortunately, due to this whole debacle, there are still 177 countries that can't even purchase the game anymore because it was removed from their storefronts. Now obviously this decision had nothing to do with Arrowhead themselves, but it would still negatively affect the morale of the player base, and it also gives bad optics to the people viewing it from the outside. And while Sony did have a hand in the decline of Helldivers, they weren't really the main culprits of it. It was actually Arrowhead themselves that was responsible for this, because Escalation of Freedom was supposed to be an update that brought the community together to celebrate all of the brand new content added to the game. Well, it did do that, just not in the way the developers were expecting it to. Now, instead of basking in overwhelming praises, they have to do damage control for something that they should have fixed a long time ago. It's actually kinda sad watching the devs turn their extremely promising game into something that's just unenjoyable and really tedious to play through because of Arrowhead's insistent fixation on trying to take the fun away from the players. They're constantly stuck on the us versus them mentality when they should be having the us and them mentality. The CEO of Helldivers once said, "A game for everybody is a game for nobody." Well, now it should be a game that's not fun to anybody is a game for nobody. But that's just me. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content in the future. See ya.